The sun had barely risen over the sprawling private airfield when a wave of heat shimmered across the tarmac, touching the blades of a sleek, obsidian-black helicopter parked alone in the center. And beside it stood a woman, tall, calm, unbothered by the chaos around her. Her name was Ayanna Ross, a woman whose quiet strength radiated louder than any words. That morning had started like any other flight test day, but destiny was waiting in the form of a man who would underestimate her in the most humiliating way. Ayanna didn't know she was only minutes away from being dismissed, laughed at, and challenged, all because someone thought she didn't belong next to a machine she herself owned. She didn't know that a millionaire's arrogance would trigger a chain of events that would break her heart open, and rebuild her life from the inside out. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and powerful stories of rising above disrespect, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Tales. Your support helps us create more stories that heal hearts. The chaos began when Morton Hale, a high-powered investor with a spotless suit and an ego polished even shinier, strutted across the tarmac. Cameras followed him, assistants jogged beside him, and 2 security guards rushed ahead, clearing the path as though royalty was approaching. The man smirked when he spotted the helicopter. Ayanna's pride, her blood, her years of sacrifice turned into steel and wings. She had founded Ross Aerotech from the ashes of a childhood filled with instability and hardship, and every bolt in that helicopter symbolized a piece of her fight. Morton Hale, however, saw something different. He saw a toy he might buy. Something to brag about. Something to let his son, a nervous young man named Corbin Hale, inherit someday so Morton could boast that he passed greatness down. The boy wasn't arrogant like his father. He was gentle, hesitant, and strangely unsure of himself, as though he lived in the shadow of someone who never taught him compassion. Ayanna noticed that immediately. Morton didn't greet her. Instead, he eyed her jumpsuit, her gloves, and the deep brown of her skin, then scoffed as though the world had offended him. He leaned toward his assistant and whispered loud enough for several engineers to hear. They looked away in embarrassment. Ayanna stood still. She had lived this scene many times, being ignored, misjudged, talked down to. But never on her own property. She swallowed the sting, kept her chin lifted, and listened as Morton announced his test. A helicopter of this caliber required a flawless pilot. He turned to Corbin and barked at him to climb in and fly it. When the trembling young man stuttered that he wasn't prepared, Morton waved him off, frustrated. Then, looking at Ayanna as if she were an object instead of a human being, he laughed booming through the quiet morning air and declared, "Fine. You, fly this heli, and I'll make him my heir. If you can prove this machine is as good as they claim, maybe I'll buy it." His tone wasn't joking. It was degrading. Ayanna felt anger rise like heat behind her ribs. She was used to proving herself, used to being tested, but this was a new level of being looked down on. She should have walked away. She should have told him the truth, that she was the founder, the CEO, the woman whose name was engraved on the certification plaque inside the cockpit. Instead, she understood something else: Corbin's eyes. The boy looked trapped. Terrified of his father. Perhaps desperate for someone, anyone, to stand up to him. So Ayanna nodded once, expression unreadable, and walked toward her helicopter. Her team watched silently, knowing what this machine meant to her. The sun glinted off the rotor blades as she climbed into the cockpit, then she took Corbin with her, helping him settle in. The young man whispered that he didn't deserve to be anyone's heir, not at the cost of someone being mocked. Ayanna simply gave him instructions, her voice steady, her heart heavy. When the engine roared to life, Morton folded his arms, smirking arrogantly. But the smirk began to fade as the helicopter lifted cleanly off the ground, smooth, precise, powerful. Ayanna's hands moved with the ease of someone who knew every wire, every vibration, every secret of the machine. She guided Corbin's trembling hands onto the controls, letting him feel the confidence of the helicopter beneath them. It wasn't about impressing Morton anymore. It was about giving this young man a moment of freedom he didn't know he craved. Corbin began to smile, small at first, then brighter. Ayana saw a spark of someone waiting to break free. They flew over the sunlit coastline, the golden haze shimmering across the water like liquid fire. She told Corbin to breathe. To trust himself. To let fear go. The boy's voice cracked when he said no one had ever believed in him. She said she did. When they landed, Morton Hale waited, impatient, unimpressed, tapping his expensive shoes. The moment his son stepped out of the helicopter with a rare glow of confidence, Morton barked at him for not performing like a real Hale. Then he turned to Ayana with a dismissive snort, as if she was an employee who had accidentally done slightly better than expected. He extended a check, large enough to buy a house, and said she could keep it for being a good pilot. But the check wasn't payment. It was an insult. Ayana didn't take it. One of the engineers finally gathered the courage to speak, voice shaking, telling Morton that she wasn't just the pilot. She wasn't an employee. She wasn't someone he could toss money at. She was the owner. The inventor. The mastermind behind everything he had just witnessed. Morton went pale. Corbin looked stunned, then proud. For the first time, he saw someone stand firm against the giant who controlled his life. Humiliated, Morton tried apologizing, stumbling over excuses. But Ayana was done. She walked away, leaving him speechless on the tarmac. What she didn't expect was Corbin running after her. The young man's eyes were wet. He confessed that he had spent his whole life believing success meant becoming like his father, cold, rigid, ruthless, and yet, after 20 minutes in the air with her, he realized that strength came from kindness. From resilience. From lifting others up instead of breaking them down. He asked her for guidance, not wealth, not inheritance, but wisdom. Something inside Ayana softened. She had never had children, but she knew what it felt like to need a mentor, a hand, a hope. She agreed to teach him, not flying, but leadership. Compassion. Courage. Over the next weeks, Corbin visited her facility daily. He learned the engineering behind helicopters, the management of people, the ethics of business. Ayana watched him transform from a quiet shadow into someone who truly wanted to make a difference. He started treating the staff with respect, learning their stories, helping wherever he could. Under her guidance, he grew, not into an heir to his father's empire, but into a human being who could build something of his own. Morton hated it at first. But as he watched his son become stronger, steadier, happier, something cracked inside him. One afternoon, he arrived at the hangar, not with arrogance, but with trembling hands and a voice stripped of pride. He admitted he had failed as a father. That he didn't want to lose his son. That he didn't know how to change, but he wanted to. It wasn't an apology to Ayana. It was a plea to Corbin, and in that moment, Ayana saw something rare, a man finally recognizing his own brokenness. She stepped back, letting father and son speak. Corbin didn't forgive everything, but he allowed the first step. Ayana knew healing wasn't instant, but it could begin. Weeks later, Morton announced he would not force Corbin to take over his empire. Instead, he would invest in a new venture, Corbin's idea, an aviation school dedicated to young people who felt unseen, unheard, underestimated. Ayana was the co-founder. The day the school opened, sunlight spilled across the runway in a warm glow, turning every metal surface gold. Ayana stood at the entrance, watching dozens of young faces, full of fear, full of hope, step toward their future. Corbin stood beside her, taller with courage, no longer afraid of his own shadow. Morton watched from a distance, humbled, changed in quiet ways only time could reveal. Ayana realized then that sometimes one moment of disrespect can become the doorway to transformation, not because of the insult, but because of what you do afterward. She had chosen dignity instead of anger, purpose instead of pride. And that choice had changed not only her life, but theirs too.